大家好，今天我们一起看看野村综合研究所首席经济学家辜朝明先生2025年7月在财讯年会上的一个演讲。他以前的演讲都是偏宏观经济的，这次的内容就完全不一样，没有谈宏观经济，而是聚焦于川普、关税和贸易。开始之前，我们稍微介绍一下辜先生的背景，已经了解的朋友可以跳过。他1954年出生于日本神户，然后1960年去东京上学，1972年到1976年就读于美国加州大学伯克利分校，获政治学与经济学学士学位。之后1981年拿到约翰霍普金斯大学的经济学硕士学位，毕业后到美国纽约联邦储备银行担任经济学家。1984年回到日本，在野村证券担任首席经济学家，一直到1996年。期间他亲身经历了日本1980年代的泡沫经济，以及1990年开始的破灭过程。1997年至今还是在野村在他的研究所担任首席经济学家。他的主要著作有《大衰退：宏观经济学的圣杯》、复盘：一个经济学家对宏观经济的另类解读、被追赶的经济体。他在学术上有一个比较大的创新和贡献，他基于对美国大萧条和日本90年代长期衰退的研究，于1997年到1998年间提出了资产负债表衰退理论。他观察到日本企业在泡沫破灭后，因资产价格暴跌、负债高企，优先偿债而非追求利润最大化，导致需求收缩，货币政策失效。因此他主张政府应该作为最后借款人，通过财政刺激维持总需求。这里是大脑透镜，我们致力于过滤信息海洋中的垃圾，为您挖掘优质内容，欢迎订阅、转发、常来。我们来看看辜先生的核心观点。他表示，强势美元是一个重大问题，导致美国制造业竞争力的下降，是贸易逆差扩大的根本原因。一旦长期出现贸易逆差，输家数量将超过赢家，会导致政治动荡与贸易保护主义。他进一步分析了川普现象的根源。美国过去40多年中位数工资仅增长 15%，而股市却上涨了 5000%， 普通工人阶层未受益于经济增长，反而不断被边缘化。美国蓝领工人变成了自由贸易输家。大脑透镜以前的视频也讲过，美国制造业衰落，工厂开到海外，比方说亚洲四小龙和中国，工人失业，利润呢回流华尔街，但是失业工人几乎没有分到这些好处，所以日积月累到今天成为川普的基本盘。他说，广场协议是由日本主动推动的，美国在里根领导下接受了日本的建议，改善了美国贸易逆差，避免了贸易保护主义的蔓延，也就是保护了自由贸易。那么现在还有没有可能签一份类似广场协议的协议呢？他说很难。一方面，川普并不关心自由贸易，更倾向于单边征税。另一方面，中国认为广场协议是美国摧毁日本的阴谋，因此拒绝参与类似合作。这一点的确，中国可能有很大比例的人认为美国通过广场协议搞垮了日本。辜先生表示，当务之急是各国协调一致压低美元，这是最有效的解决办法。长期考虑，应该回归稳定、公平、共享的全球贸易体系，需要减少自由贸易输家的数量。关于广场协议是由日本主动推动的，辜先生表示，有一名日本记者写了一本书，明确记载了这个事情。我相信这里和我们大部分人的认知差异非常大。有没有了解那段历史的朋友，或者有深度研究的朋友？好，要点我们就分享到这里，接下来是辜朝明先生演讲的完整版，有兴趣的朋友请继续，大家也可以点击链接直接到财讯官方频道欣赏。如果我们的内容对您有帮助，请帮忙订阅、转发给您的朋友。
Good afternoon. It's nice to be here for the 10th time. I didn't realize that I've been here for so often. But this time, I would like to talk about something very different from what I've been talking here over the last years. Instead of talking about macroeconomy, I like to talk about trade and Trump and tariffs. Now, some of you may ask me, what qualification do I have to talk about trade? because after all, I'm a macroeconomist. Well, 30 years ago, something else was happening. It was a trade war between Japan and United States. And I was right in the middle of it. And let me explain how that happened. First of all, this is how this shows the share of countries, especially Asian countries, as a percentage of US trade deficit. And if you look back in the 1990s, you notice that Japan, one country alone, was 65% of US trade deficit. Today, China is only 25% of US trade deficit. And you see how much trade war is going on. Japan alone was 65. And Americans were very, very upset because Japanese were sending so many cars and cameras to US, but US was only able to send so few things to Japan. And many markets were actually quite closed. But the fight between the two sides were getting really, really ugly. Well, one day, US ambassador to Japan, Mr. Walter Mondale, who was a former vice president under President Carter, called me into his office in Tokyo and asked me whether I can represent US trade positions to the Japanese TV audience. And I was appearing in Japanese television a lot, and Walter Mondale realized that I actually carry an American passport. So why don't we use this guy to represent the US trade positions? And when that was given to, the offer was made to me, I said to myself, this is a high-risk, low-return undertaking because US Embassy or State Department, US Treasury are not paying me, only Nomura is paying me. And looking like this, working for a Japanese company, I have to fight for the US trade positions? Now, give me a break, right? What do I gain from this thing? But I was born in Japan, raised in Japan, then I got education in the United States. I did not like to see these countries fighting with each other. So after some thought, I said, okay, Ambassador, I'll do it. So every time Japan had a big television program on US-Japan trade, and that was very frequent in those days because the fighting was so bad, I would go to the US Embassy first, and I get the full briefing on semiconductors, auto parts, few Fuji Kodak issues, if you can remember those things, cherries, a whole bunch of other things. And then I go to the Japanese television station. And the TV studios, all these Japanese are there to wait to shoot me down. I'm the only one on the American side. So it was quite an experience. Not always a pleasant one, I assure you, because trade issues can get very, very emotional, very nationalistic, almost racist. And not racist on one side only, it's on both sides. For Japanese were saying that, hey, Americans are not serious about sending goods to Japan. They never make the right-hand drive car. Japan drives on the opposite side. So the steering wheel has to be on that side. The Americans never make those cars. So I had to be in the middle of it, trying to explain why it is in the interest of Japan to address this problem. Because if the Japan didn't, the situation would just get worse and worse and worse, and the Japanese yen could go sky high. Well, Japanese yen did go sky high after that, 79, 75 yen to the dollar. And then Japanese began to open its market. Well, I never thought that experience was so useful today in understanding what's going on between Japan, United States, and China. And quite a few Chinese policymakers have visited me in Tokyo to see what they can learn from my experience back in the 1990s. So that's my qualification of talking about trade. So let me get back to the main topic. Trump, trade, and tariffs. A lot of people wonder, how did Trump got elected in the first place? I mean, he was outsider to begin with. We know he has so many personal problems, other problems. He's actually a convicted criminal. And for Americans to vote for a convicted criminal takes some courage. Because Americans have typically, in American families, it's very typical to tell your kids, if the kid is not studying, that, hey, if you study hard, work hard, you can become the president of this country. That's a very typical conversation in American families. And what happens if the kid says, well, if the criminal can become a president, I don't have to study. What are you going to do, right? I would argue that that last November election, I don't think Trump actually won. It's the establishment that lost. And that's a pretty strong statement to make, because some of you would say, but the American economy was doing fine November 2024. Unemployment rate was only 4.1%, which is very low by historical standards. Consumption was strong, investment was strong, stock prices are all-time high, house prices are doing great. What's wrong with, economy doing so poorly? Well, those are the numbers we in the financial market or the economists typically look at. But if you look at some other numbers, the picture is not so pretty. I don't know how many of you have seen this movie called America's Burning, which was released middle of last year. And it was put together by someone named David Smick. And those of you who are in the US bond market over the last 30, 20 years, you know his name, right? Because if you don't receive Johnson-Smick report, you won't be able to play in the US bond market at all, because he was so powerful, so important. And this movie was made. How much did the share prices, stock market, New York Dow, went from 1980 to 2023, a year before the movie was made? So in this 43 years, how much did stock market go up in the United States? Any guess? 5,000%. 5,000%. How much did American workers' wages, real wages, gone up the same period from 1980 to 2023? Well, as this chart shows, I can't get it. The number is 15%. This one has our latest numbers in it, so it's still 16.2. But when the movie was made, it was 15%. So in 43 years, American wages in real terms only increased by 15%. And this 15% is a median number, not an average number. Average is much higher because some Americans make lots of money. The median means 50% of the Americans had real wage growth less than 15% over the 43 years, which means millions and millions of people probably had real wage growth far less than zero. And so you have the situation where if you're in the stock market, if you got some money, you are doing great. But if you're the average workers working, you did very, very poorly. And on top of that, you don't have to have shares to live, but you have to have houses to live. And this chart shows what happened to house prices relative to what I just told you, the 15%. And as you can see, wages only increased by 15%. This one has 16 because of latest numbers. House prices almost went up by 100%. So many people are feeling poorer and poorer during this whole period. So there were a lot of very unhappy people in the United States. This is the division of US society that you often hear about. Now, how does this group and Trump connect? For that answer, you have to go back to 2015, 2016. That's when Trump first entered the presidential race. And when he entered the presidential race, 2015, most people, including myself, did not take him very seriously, right? What does this guy know? He has been featured in the television, kind of handsome, but other than that, he knows nothing except real estate. So why should anyone vote for this guy? That's how most people took him at the beginning. But that all changed when he started talking about protectionism. When he started talking about protecting industries, protecting workers, protecting jobs, suddenly millions and millions of workers start supporting Trump. And this was a shock to both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The Republicans were shocked for two reasons. One, Republican parties always stood for free trade. So how could anyone from their own camp talk about protectionism? This is supposed to be no-no. This Republican Party always stood for free trade. But the second surprise was that by speaking about protectionism, they were getting so much support from the American workers that they were never able to get in the past. Massive numbers, millions and millions are supporting Trump. So for the Republican Party, it was a kind of a pleasant surprise. For the Democrats, it was far worse. Because Democrats thought these people are supposed to be voting for them, not the Republicans. But they're all starting to support Trump, and some of them very strongly. At that time, it was Hillary Clinton who was competing with Trump, if you remember. She panicked because she realized that the supporters she was counting on were all moving toward Trump. So she dumped TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnerships, which she herself negotiated. And she started talking about protectionism herself. And if you remember the scene where Hillary got nominated to become the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, you look at the arena where thousands and thousands of Democrats were saying, Hillary, Hillary. You look at the scene, you notice that everyone was carrying one sign. And the sign was saying, no to TPP, which she herself negotiated. So that's how Democrats were trying to make this very sharp U-turn to save her candidacy. Unfortunately, it was too late. Trump won. That should have been a huge warning to the establishment that they ignore this group of people for too long. And why this connect with what I just said earlier about the U.S. Society is being divided? It's divided between those who benefited from free trade and those who are hurt from free trade. And those who are hurt from free trade are, in effect, the victims of U.S. trade deficit. They are the ones who were displaced, who lost their jobs, their income went down, and it was Trump's genius to realize that there's a lot of unhappy people there, which neither Democrats nor Republicans addressed, because Republicans were always for free trade. Democrats never talked about the dollar, which caused all these problems. The dollar was way too strong. But Democrats did absolutely nothing about the dollar. Republicans were all for free trade, so of course did nothing. And there's millions of people over the years that ended up feeling very badly. So this shows how much United States, this chart shows what happened to US trade deficit. And you can see that it's a pretty ugly picture. Now, if you look at this carefully, at the beginning, in the 1970s here, US trade was more or less in balance, a little bit in red, but more or less in balance. But starting 1980, it started getting worse and worse and worse. This is not adjusted for inflation, so if you adjust for inflation, this part will look much worse. In 1980, what happened was that, until 1980, let me put it this way, it was not possible for Americans to buy Japanese stocks or Taiwanese papers or German bonds. And it was not possible for Japanese to buy US treasuries or US stocks because international capital flows were largely prohibited until 1980. So if you have money, you only invest in your own country and not someone else's country. But in 1980, Americans started this whole move to allow investors across to go between the countries. So cross-border capital flows were liberalized starting in 1990. And then all this money from Europe and Japan start heading toward the United States because US had much higher interest rates, and that strengthened the dollar. The dollar went as high as 280 Japanese yen to $1. And as a result, as you can see here, the trade deficit began to grow very rapidly. And by 1985, so 5 years later, the protectionist call for protectionism, because the dollar was way too strong at 280 or like 3.5 Deutsche Marks. Nobody in the United States could compete at that kind of exchange rate. So everybody was asking for protectionism. It was said in Washington at that time there are only two companies left who are still in favor of free trade. One is Boeing, the other one is Coca-Cola, as you can imagine. Everyone else, Caterpillar, IBM, all the other companies were demanding protectionism. At that time, luckily, U.S. president was the name of U.S. president was Ronald Reagan, a Republican and a staunch free trader. So when he realized that the whole country was moving toward protectionism, just like we see today, he said to himself, how can we save free trade? And he basically pushed his Treasury Secretary, Jim Baker, to come up with a scheme to save free trade. And at that time, actually, it was the Japanese who were telling the Americans, your dollar is crazy at that such a high level. We, the Japanese, cannot stop Japanese exporters from exporting to the US. So that's where you get that 65% number that you saw earlier. So you have to bring this thing down to save free trade and keep economies away from protectionism. At the beginning, Reagan was not interested because he believed in really free trade, so government should not get involved. But by 1985, the situation was so bad that even Reagan said, oh my gosh, we have to do something. So they basically took the Japanese advice, and that became the Plaza Accord. So once the Plaza Accord was put in place, exchange rate was 240 at the beginning. It was pushed down to 120, exactly half in about a year and a half. And then as you can see, the numbers, US trade numbers began to improve. Instead of going further down, it began to improve. With Europe, US started running trade surpluses. So that was great. Well, that was the last time US did anything about the dollar. After that, they kind of said, everything is fine. We can all have a nice party and go home. So since that time, since about 1987, US did absolutely nothing about the dollar. Dollar strengthened again, and as you can see, US trade deficit kept on growing, with US taking zero actions on the exchange rate. Some of you in the financial market, maybe many of you here are from the financial market, we have been told by a lot of economists that, trade deficit doesn't matter. I mean, US is running deficit. Don't bother. We can still buy dollars. Dollar will be strong. I'm sure you have heard this argument before. But how can anyone say trade deficit doesn't matter if you have any interest in GDP growth rate? We all have interest in GDP growth rate. We heard some of that from our cabinet minister just now. But every dollar of US trade deficit is subtracted from the US GDP. Every dollar of trade surplus is added to GDP. So if you are interested in GDP growth, you cannot ignore trade because it's such a large part of it. And because the US allowed these massive deficits to continue, US lost huge amounts of GDP during this period. How much did they lose? Well, this chart, if you look at the middle part, here, if you add all the GDP that was lost as a result of the last 43 years of the trade deficit, it adds up to 153% of US GDP. And if you translate that into dollars, It's almost $42 trillion. This is no peanuts. So if U.S. did not run trade deficit, U.S. GDP would have been, $42 trillion bigger than where it is now. And this 42 trillion is not borne by the Americans equally. It was borne by those people who suffered from trade deficits, right? Because this is the number of trade deficits. And so there was a huge number of people who suffered from this $42 trillion. And when you look at the number just above it is the UK, England. And then you see that the number is actually bigger, 180%. It's no wonder that the Brits got themselves out of Eurozone, EU. That was 2016. They were already running such a large trade deficit. But if you are in the free trade zone, you cannot stop your imports from coming in because you are in the free trade zone. And I'm sure millions of people in England, in Britain, lost their jobs, lost their income, and were suffering. But you're not supposed to say, hey, let's get out of a free trade zone. It's supposed to be no. But David Cameron decided to put this on a vote. And all these people who were suffering from imports just said, okay, let's get out. And that's basically what happened to the UK 2016. In 2016, we got Trump as well. And now he's trying to move the United States away from free trade. And so I think these two numbers are very, very important. And some of you might say, wow, but the US is not a low-wage country. Mexican wages are cheaper, Vietnamese wages are cheaper, Chinese wages are cheaper. You can never stop this thing from happening. But if you look at the other numbers here, Germany actually gained from free trade 280% of GDP, Japan 45% of GDP, Italy 41%, Canada 85% of GDP. So all of these countries were actually gaining from free trade, but the UK and US were losing from free trade. And that is because those two countries, US and UK, didn't really care about the exchange rate. The dollar was allowed to remain strong for so long, and basically that's how this situation happened. The next question then is, why did US did nothing during this nearly 40 years? After the plaza, the remaining almost 40 years, how come US did nothing about it? Well, I'm afraid it's our fault. Our fault in the sense that my profession, economics profession, really made a huge mistake. And at the beginning, we were taught that this room is full of economists, so I might get a lot of flack later on in the panel from my economist friends, but let me explain. If you remember your college days when you have possibly taken class on international trade, I'm sure you were taught that free trade creates both winners and losers in the same economy, but the gain the winners get are much bigger than the loss of the losers. So if you put everyone together, free trade always creates more winners and losers. That's how it was taught to me. I'm sure it was the way it was taught to you as well. So if that is true, the winners of free trade has to be always more than the losers of free trade. But those professors never taught us one thing, and that is that for that condition, at this point, of course, comes from David Ricardo's comparative advantage argument. But those professors never told us one thing, and that is that for that conclusion to hold, trade has to be either in balance or in surplus. In that case, that condition holds. winners will be always greater than losers. But suppose the country runs trade deficits year after year after year. Then the number of people who consider themselves losers will begin to grow. By 2016, this group was large enough to elect Trump president. That's the situation we are in today. But we were never taught about this possibility because all these economists assumed that winners are always greater than the number of losers. David Ricardo's model, if you go back and think about it, doesn't have any currency in it. But once you put the currency in it, then you get a different conclusion. So that's one of the biggest mistakes we made, that we assume that the free trade is always safe politically because the number of winners are always greater than the number of losers. Then the next one, I'm sure many of you have heard a million times over already, is this whole notion that US trade deficit is a US savings problem or lack of savings in the United States. That Americans can only produce so much, but the domestic demand in the United States is like that. So the gap between this production and the demand is filled by the foreigners. The Japanese, Taiwanese, South Koreans, Chinese, they are filling this gap. But that's because Americans cannot produce enough. They don't save enough. You know, you heard this argument a million times over, right? So many American economists are talking like this too. So if you are in that situation, and if the President of the United States asks you, suppose you are a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, I heard that trade deficit is bad. What shall I do about it? If you are the learned economist, you're supposed to tell the President, Mr. President, this is not an easy issue. If you want to reduce our trade deficit, we have to bring the domestic demand down, which means cutting the budget deficit, bringing the economy into recession. And when the president hears this word recession, you typically say, oh no, that's not good for my re-election. Forget about it. Let's do something else. And that's how trade deficit was allowed to continue for so long. If you have to reduce the domestic demand, that means economy have to be in recession. And that's not the price they did not want to pay. But is this argument correct? And I will argue that this argument is totally incorrect. Why? Because if this argument is correct, something else must also be correct. What is that something else? Well, the something else is that if you can only produce so much, but the demand is here, those people, the American producers competing with imports, should be doing great. Right? Everything you can produce are selling like hotcakes, and you cannot produce more. That means your wages are rising, your prices are rising, your share prices are rising, your profits are rising. You should be very happy. But what happened to all those companies who used to make lots of things in the United States, from household appliances, refrigerators, cars, cameras, whatever? They're almost all gone. Only 2.5 auto companies left, maybe 2 aircraft manufacturers. That's about it. How do you explain this outcome with this theory, which says that they were selling everything they were making, still could not meet the demand, wages should be rising, prices should be rising, profits should be rising? That theory and the reality we face are totally different. Then how do you explain this reality? What will cause this outcome? I already mentioned you the answer. Strong dollar. If the dollar is too strong, whatever the Americans produce are not competitive vis-a-vis the Japanese, vis-a-vis the Taiwanese, or vis-a-vis others. And Americans say, well, why should I buy this expensive product when I can buy a cheaper one from Japan or Taiwan? So that's how those companies all went bankrupt. So the problem is not the savings and investment balance. It's the dollar. If I may use the simple word, it's the dollar, stupid. That is the gist of the problem. And the third point is that this whole notion that Whatever the market decides is best. And those of us who live in the market economy, we of course like to think that, and I believe that in most cases. But you look at the situation today, or back in 1985, the dollar is so strong that the whole economy, whole society is moving toward protectionism. But once you put in the protectionism and the free trade goes out the window, we will all suffer. And we have that experience back in 1930s. In 1930s, this one started with the United States again, he put in this Smoot-Hawley tariff, a very high tariff, just like what Trump is doing right now. And that led to the retaliations and others. World trade collapsed by 66%. 66%. Just imagine Taiwan's export going down 66%. What kind of economy do we think we got left here? That's basically what happened with protectionism. And so how can we say that the dollar exchange rate that we see today is the best exchange, the optimum exchange rate, when that is leading us toward protectionism, which killed everybody back in the 1930s. And finally, this last point, the government cannot affect the exchange rate. This arrow, what I call arrow 4. I don't know how it is in Taiwan, actually, because Taiwan still have this foreign exchange controls, and central bank is doing all sorts of things to keep the exchange rate from moving too much. But outside Taiwan, let me put it this way. Most foreign exchange traders will tell you that government really cannot affect exchange rates, because the amount of money the central bank can put into the intervention is very tiny compared to the daily trading volume of the foreign exchange market. And I can tell you this because I was at the foreign exchange desk at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York back in 1984, just prior to the Plaza Accord. So I know, because I was involved in the foreign exchange intervention, I know how much money central bank can mobilize in these foreign exchange interventions. It's actually quite tiny. And the daily trading volume is like that. Central bank can only move this much money. How can central bank affect the exchange rate? Sounds correct, except when you think about Plaza Accord. If that argument is correct, and this argument was made in 1985 during Plaza as well, at the beginning, most of the traders in the market were saying, come on, there's no way these countries can move the exchange rate. We control the exchange rate. Well, as I said earlier, it moved from 240 to 120. How was that made possible when central bank only intervened so little? It's very simple if you think about it. Central bank is the only player in the foreign exchange market that does not have to worry about making money. Whereas everyone else, exporters, importers, investors, speculators, they are in the foreign exchange market to make money, not to prove how strong they are. They are there to make money. So if the people who doesn't have to make money is heading toward you, and then you might have a lot of money, but you still have to make money at the end, you have to think, do I want to pick this fight? Do I want to fight with these guys? And exporters and importers have no choice. They have to do the foreign exchange conversions. But if you're an investor, you have a choice. Do I want to stay in the foreign exchange market or get myself out? Or whatever the dollar positions you have, you want to put the hedges on it? You have a choice. And when these guys are coming, some of these people will say, oh, maybe I just stay away from this and move aside. Or they say, maybe I just square my positions so that even if the central bank are successful, you're not hurt. But if you're a long dollar and you want to square your positions, how do you square your positions? Of course, you have to sell the dollars you bought. And so it's the selling of these dollars by speculators and investors that push the dollar down to such a low level. And to make in case some of you will say, but there are so many cases that central banks fail to move the exchange rate. Well, if you look at all the interventions that failed and the ones that succeeded, the key difference is this. Central bank moving the exchange rate in a direction suggested by the trade balance. So if they're trying to push the dollar down because the US is running a trade deficit, those interventions usually works. But if you do the opposite, like the Bank of England in 1992, the country is running a huge trade deficit, but you want to keep the exchange rate from falling by intervening, those typically fails. And Bank of England failed. George Soros made tons of money. We all know that 1992. Why? The reason is quite simple. If the central bank is trying to push the dollar down, when the US is trying to push the dollar down like in 1985, Federal Reserve potentially have unlimited ammunition. Because the only thing US have to do is to print the dollars and sell in the foreign exchange market. They can do as much as they want if they want to do it. So if you are the investors facing the central bank coming at you, not only you have to make money at the end, but the other side has unlimited ammunition. You have lots of money here, but your ammunition is still limited. You don't have unlimited. But the other guys potentially have unlimited ammunition. So when those guys start coming at you, then you really have to say, do I want to fight with these guys? And that's how Plaza worked. And so there are 4 errors, I would argue, error 1, 2, 3, and 4, that prevented government from taking the action to reduce the trade deficit. But suppose all these 4 are correct. I said they are all wrong, but suppose you believe what your professors told you, or your market foreign exchange traders in your company told you, that these things are all correct. And if you are one of the victims of the $42 trillion, if you are one of the victims of this trade deficit in the United States, the only logical option for you is to vote for Trump, because Trump is talking about protectionism. So once you put the walls around you, and then the imports cannot come in, then at least you're safe, at least for the short run. And that's how we ended up with Trump. It's a very logical choice. And I cannot forgive Republicans and Democrats for ignoring these people for so long, because I actually tried to work for them in Japan, fighting the Japanese trade hawks 30 years ago. So if you read many of my books, I always talk about this issue at the end, because I thought one day we're going to get Trump. And unfortunately, we got one. There are 2 ways to reduce trade deficits, right? One is tariffs, and the other one is exchange rate adjustments. And unfortunately, Trump is all for tariffs. But I would argue that tariff is the wrong way to go, because the disadvantages of tariffs are just too large. It has advantage, of course. It's very easy to do. When Trump decides, he can do it. But disadvantages are also huge, because it might invite retaliation, as it happened in 1930s. 25 countries retaliated against the United States, and then the world trade dropped by 66%, as I mentioned to you earlier. And tariffs is always arbitrary decision. On this item, show 25%, but this item, 45%, oh, this item, 15%. It's all decided by some bureaucrats or some politicians, but the businesses will have to adjust all of these things all the time. That's very, that creates tons of uncertainty. It results in huge misallocation of resources. So the economy will slow down quite a bit, because efficiency, productivity will go down as a result. And finally, even if you move the tariffs up, if the exchange rate moves in the opposite direction, you go back to your original position, except that the economy will be that much less efficient, that much less productive. And in the past, exchange rate often moved in the opposite direction to the tariffs. So until you do something about the exchange rate, you can never be sure that tariffs will actually reduce the trade deficit. On the other hand, if you go for the exchange rate adjustments here, advantages are huge because it will be able to maintain free trade. Plaza Accord maintained free trade. And there's no productivity or efficiency losses because it applies to all the products across the board. So there is no relative changes in prices. There are disadvantages as well, because in the short run, if there could be a disruption in the financial market, because if the U.S. government, for example, tomorrow announced that, okay, we're going to push the dollar down like in Plaza. Well, if you're holding U.S. Treasuries now as a foreigner, you don't want to be holding on to the U.S. Treasuries, right? Because the dollar will be falling. So you sell the U.S. Treasury, change the money back to the new Taiwan dollar, but in the process, everybody will be selling U.S. Treasuries. So U.S. interest rates will go up, and that'll be very painful for the U.S. economy. So U.S. president might not want to see interest rates going up or stock market going down as a result of this exchange rate adjustment. This will be just temporary, because once the dollar comes down to a lower level, people will come back to buy U.S. Treasuries again. So it's just during the adjustments. It's a very short-term pain, but it could still be painful for the government in power. And the second point is, to do this, you need a coordination with foreign monetary authorities. So it's not just U.S. or it's not just Japan, but all the countries have to agree to do this together. And adjustments to do this together takes lots of effort. Right now, Trump is on tariffs, and he is kind of quiet on the exchange rate. But you know what happened to the tariffs after April 2nd. Well, let me put it this way. Until April 2nd, even though Trump was talking about tariffs, the markets are more or less okay. There was nothing really disturbing. And the reason for that is that there was fundamental unfairness in the trading system that was in place before April 2nd. And you may wonder what I mean by fundamental unfairness. When the United States put together this GATT system, General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, back in 1948, this is right after World War II, U.S. to start the free trade regime that we all are so used to. Europe, Japan were in a mess because this is right after World War II. So European industrial base were completely destroyed. Japanese industrial base was completely destroyed. So United States basically allowed within the GATT system that you can decide whatever the tariff rates you want, as long as you apply this tariff rates to all the members within the GATT system. You cannot discriminate one country against the other. Everyone has to be paying the same tariff rates. That was the free trade system the US put in. But that also meant that Japanese and Europeans put the tariff rates pretty high because they had to rebuild their industries. And Americans kind of allowed that because United States also wanted Japan and Western Europe to recover after World War II and in the face of Cold War with the Soviet Union right next to you. So there was this huge difference in US tariff rates, Japanese and European tariff rates, and even Taiwan tariff rates. But once the economies began to recover, they had whole rounds of tariff negotiations, and these rates are brought down, brought down, brought down. But even today, tariff rates on average are higher abroad than the US. And that's why Trump keeps on saying, if the same product moved from United States to Europe, it incurs very high tariff rates. But the same product going from Europe to United States, it's almost zero tariff rates. This is not fair. And it is unfair. So when Trump started talking about adjusting these unfair tariff rates, other countries did not really come out and say, no, we won't let you do that, because they themselves knew that there was lots of unfairness in it. So trade negotiators in Japan, Europe, maybe in Taiwan, told you people that, oh, we're going to resist this Trump nonsense. We're not going to be bullied by the Americans. They tell you in public. But in private, they know that they had to do something because it is actually unfair. But the fact that these people are all willing to negotiate means that some sort of a nice solution was actually possible before April 2nd. And if on April 2nd, Americans came out with a reasonable tariff rates, I think that would be the end of the story. But you know what happened on April 2nd? They come out with these absolutely ridiculous numbers that no one could justify. Even Americans couldn't justify. It was so ridiculous. Then the market blew up, stock market collapsed, bond market went sky high, the dollar started coming down. That really shocked the market, shocked the world. And we were all flabbergasted by this crazy tariff rates that Trump came up with. But soon enough, lots of supporters of Republican Party, those who contributed money to Republican campaigns, Trump campaign, others, start calling up Trump and saying, if you don't fix this problem, we're not going to contribute money to you anymore. Because those Republican donors thought by voting for Trump, economy would be better and they would be richer. But instead, the economy is getting worse, markets collapsing, your asset values are collapsing. So they all start calling the Trump campaigners, Trump campaign. That really worked. Actually, at the very moment, I was in Washington having lunch with a very old Republican hand. And he was telling me that as we are eating lunch, there are so many phone calls coming to the Republican offices from these donors telling them that if Trump doesn't fix this problem, they won't contribute to Republicans anymore. It was that afternoon that Trump announced ceasefire, 90 days. So even Trump has to listen to these Republican donors, and the donors are responsive to the market. So that's something we should keep in mind, that if the market goes, the Republican donors will call Trump campaign, and then Trump will have to listen. That's basically what happened on the second week of April. As a result, I think Trump is going to be a little more reasonable than where he was before April 2nd. He will still have to put in some tariffs because he already promised to his constituents that he's going to do these things, and that will reduce the trade deficit. But as I indicated to you earlier, I don't think these moves will have much impact on the actual trade deficit as long as the dollar remains strong. So for the real solution, they have to address the dollar issue. And as I indicated to you earlier, the dollar problem started after 1980, once these international capital flows were freed. But we cannot go back to the world that existed before 1980 because, so many of us, all of us in this room, we have lots of, foreign assets, foreign financial assets. We cannot just go back to the world that we are not supposed to hold any foreign assets. That is not in the cards. I don't think that's even possible. So what's left is the exchange rate adjustment itself. And this one, let me put it this way. Americans really screwed up. If United States understood this issue 40 years ago and did not allow the dollar to remain so strong, we won't be seeing Trump today. So it's all American problem. Americans screwed up. But because Americans screwed up and the dollar remained strong, so many other countries benefited massively including Taiwan, including Japan, including China, including Europe. And so, yes, it's an American problem, but those of us who benefited from the American mistake, now we have to do some sort of a burden sharing on how to bring this back to something more normal, something that preserves the free trade. That's the challenge we face. And what we have to do is to make sure that Americans who feel that they are losers of free trade never outnumber the winners. That's what we need to shoot for. We cannot balance all the trade. That's impossible. But if we can somehow reduce the number of people who consider themselves losers of free trade, then we should be able to go back to free trade. So what is the chances of something like a Plaza Accord happening all over again? It was already mentioned. I think there's some chance, not a whole lot, because now it's situation is a lot more serious now than in 1985. In 1985, it was very bad, but free trade was still in place. And Reagan did the right thing to stop the protectionists from winning the day. But now, free trade is crumbling. And so the urgency must be much stronger in all the capitals around the world. And of course, currency devaluation is the right way to go. And global economy maintained its stability. After the Plaza, we didn't have any massive market collapse. We didn't have huge increase in inflation. We didn't have huge deceleration of economies. None of that. Economy did fine after 1986, 87, 88. Things were fine. And Plaza also proved that many countries that were benefiting from strong dollar were actually willing to see their currencies go up if that is necessary to save free trade. As I indicated to you earlier, it's Japan that started this whole discussion. And if you don't believe that, I suggest that you read this book. It's called Managing the Dollar, From Plaza to Louvre Accord, by a Japanese journalist by the name of Mr. Funabashi. And I know him very well. This book goes through all the details of how Plaza Accord was put in place, and it will show very clearly that it was originally a Japanese idea, not American ideas at all. In fact, Japanese had to convince Reagan that if you do nothing, the protectionists will win the day, which is not in your interest. So we all have to work together to bring the dollar down. And finally, President Reagan agreed. And compared to last time, during the Plaza, there were so many different European currencies: Italian lira, German mark, French franc, and all of them were in this thing called EMS, European Monetary System. And it was very difficult to control these different currencies during the Plaza adjustment, because French franc might go this way, Italian lira might go that way, and it was very difficult management issue. Today, we only have single currency, the euro. So it's much, much easier to manage the same process compared to 40 years ago. So those are all the positives that may cause governments to move towards some sort of a coordinated exchange adjustment. And if it's coordinated, the damage to us in Taiwan, for example, will be much less than it's only Taiwanese dollar going up and everybody else is not going up, in which case the damage to Taiwan will be much greater. But if all the currencies move up together, the damage to Taiwan will be minimal. But what are the factors that are against Plaza? And I'm afraid there are quite a few things that are against having something like Plaza. And the first one is, as I indicated here, President Trump himself is a protectionist. I mean, last time it was Reagan. Reagan wanted to save free trade. In order to save free trade, he put in Plaza. But we have a president who doesn't care about the free trade. So someone else has to take the lead. And it's very, I don't think Japanese can take the lead, because if the Japanese take the lead, the Chinese will go the opposite direction, and all sorts of problems. So this leadership issue, or the lack of leadership issue, is a big stumbling block if the US cannot move on its own, if the US cannot be the leader. And China here is a big problem, because any agreement on currency will have to include China this time around. Last time, China was a very small player. Now, this is the biggest player. But in China, or Chinese, believe that Plaza Accord was an American conspiracy to destroy Japan. And I was told in dinner yesterday that many people in Taiwan also believe that. I can tell you 100% that that view is wrong. It's not an American conspiracy to destroy Japan. It's a Japanese conspiracy to save free trade. That's how it all started. And that's why I had to bring this book here to prove, because in here you can read it, that it was the Japanese working on the Jim Baker and other people in the US government to push the dollar down. But in China, everyone believes that Plaza is what destroyed Japan. So they are determined that they will never follow the Japanese footsteps. But if China doesn't join, nothing will work. So every time I do get to go to China or have a chance to speak with the Chinese people, I try to remind them that Plaza is not an American conspiracy to destroy Japan. It's totally different. It's a Japanese plan to save free trade. And I have to add that who benefited most from Plaza? It's China. Just imagine, in 1985, free trade disappeared. Do you think China can get to where they are today? They may still drive, riding bicycles today. It's the free trade that allowed China to grow to where it is today. So China is the biggest beneficiary of Plaza. And once that point is understood, maybe China will change its mind. This book is actually published in Chinese, 2018. And it's been out of print since then. But I was able to convince the publisher in China, CITIC Press, that they should put this back in print, because this is very, very important. And they agreed to do it, so you can go to China and you can still buy the Chinese version if it's translated correctly. That I don't know. So if China understood this and said, okay, let's do it, then maybe we can actually do this coordinated action to save free trade. And if US interest rates rise temporarily, maybe we can come up with a scheme where if the US rates start rising, central banks around the world will buy US treasuries on a temporary basis. And when the adjustment is done, and when people start coming back to the dollar assets, then central banks should unload their US treasuries. Some arrangement like that. I think that would be very useful. The only thing that needs to be done is that once the adjustment is made, it has to be kept there. And this is the part that a lot of people have problems with. How can we come up with some sort of mechanism to make sure that exchange rate will stay within this reasonable range so that US trade deficit will not grow again? Well, that's a big challenge that we all have to work on. And during the Plaza, they tried to work on it, especially the French government was trying to put this together, but somehow Americans did not go for it. Well, the chances of something like that happening anytime soon is still very small. But we continuously make efforts in that direction, and I've been doing that for the last 20 years, actually. Maybe it will happen someday. And once that happens, then we can get the free trade back. But until that happens, I'm afraid we are in this very wild jungle of tariff rates and retaliations and this and that. So that's the kind of a long-term picture. Let me just finish with a very short-term comment. When Trump was elected, somehow foreign exchange traders start talking about so-called Trump trade, and the dollar went up, the U.S. stock market went up, and the U.S. looked like a winner, so-called U.S. exceptionalism. I thought that was absolutely stupid, because if you remember 8 years earlier, they should know that once a U.S. president starts talking about U.S. trade deficit, the whole character of the foreign exchange market changes. Until Trump came on board, 2016, most foreign exchange traders in the market were just looking at the interest rate differentials, right? Taiwan interest rate so low, U.S. interest rate so high, let's go buy U.S. dollars. Forget the U.S. trade deficit, all right? And the Japanese were doing the same, Europeans are doing the same. But once Trump came on board and he started talking about trade deficit every day, investors in the foreign exchange market began to worry that this U.S. president might just pick up the phone, call Steve Mnuchin, his Treasury Secretary, and say, hey, the dollar is too strong, I'm sick of it, bring it down. That one phone call will probably push the dollar down by 20% in about 20 minutes. And so if you are long dollars, you have to worry about this risk, because he wants to bring the U.S. trade deficit down. Bringing the dollar down is the most direct way of doing it, and that's only one phone call away. Once Trump picks up the phone, calls Steven Mnuchin, the dollar will be down. And I think that pushed a lot of investors to the sidelines, as I mentioned to you earlier, like in Plaza. And many of them probably put hedges on their foreign exchange exposure in US dollars. That pushed the dollar down. As a result, as you can see in this chart, during Trump's first term, Federal Reserve actually increased interest rates 8 times. Japan, Europe, or Taiwan did nothing, right? So interest rates differential kept on increasing in favor of the US dollar. But in the whole period, as you can see, this is against the Japanese yen, the dollar kept on falling. So US increased interest rate 8 times, Japanese Bank of Japan did nothing, European Central Bank did nothing, but the dollar actually came down, not up. So when you have a US president talking about the US trade deficit every day, you have to change your mindset about the foreign exchange market. Because people will start paying attention to the US trade deficit, that means the dollar should not go up, should actually go down. And that's basically what happened 8 years ago. That's basically what's happening at this very moment. And this contrast that I made, that if you have a president like this, the whole characteristic of the foreign exchange market changes, I think was proven very conclusively once Joe Biden became the president. That Joe Biden, 4 years, he never talked about trade deficit, not even once. So all the foreign exchange traders returned to their bad habits, looking at the exchange rate, interest rate differential, and pushed the dollar higher and higher and higher, which is why Japanese yen went all the way to 160. So my suggestion to you is that as long as Trump is president, and as long as he keeps on talking about US trade deficit or the need to reduce trade deficit, I don't think it's a good idea to bet on strong dollar. And it actually could go down further. So for Taiwan, or for all the countries around the world, the best way is to move the dollar down together. That will minimize the damage to the Taiwanese economy, the Chinese economy, Japanese economy. Because if we could do something like a plaza where everybody moved together, then the damage will be minimal. Only the US trade with the United States will be affected. Trade with Europe, trade with other countries in Asia will not be affected. That's the best. But as I said earlier, until China understands that Plaza was there to save free trade, not to destroy Japan, I don't think it will happen anytime soon. So in the meantime, please be alert to the fact that we have a president in the United States talking about trade deficits every day, and he's supported by those millions of people who had very low wage growth over the last 40 years. And once Trump discovered this part of the US political scene, which both Republicans and Democrats ignored, we cannot go back to the old world anymore. Someone has to address the grievances of these people, millions of these blue-collar workers in the United States. And only after that, we can go back to the world that we enjoy so much, the free trade. So it's going to be a very long struggle, a lot of political issues involved, but I'm afraid this is a 40-year problem that we have to resolve. And I hope it won't take 40 years to resolve it, but we have to move in a direction if we want to say free trade. Thank you very much.